to meet a Soviet leader, and if he could show him, by taking him on a helicopter ride, that most Americans have, or many Americans have swimming pools, that he would see the error of his ways and become like a nice Midwestern American. I have a friend who is of the view that there is no such thing as an English accent, that the English put this on to intimidate Americans. And if you can only catch an Englishman unawares, like waking him up at 4 in the morning when he's not ready for you, he will talk like a normal human being. This is an attitude that we often also characterize as our foreign policy. In 1917, when the United States ended World War I, the German emperor had been governing for 27 years, for 29 years. And he had been an unshirted nuisance. But it had never occurred to anyone that the peace of the world depended on his removal. When the United States ended the war, the domestic structure of Germany became one of the principal war aims. And we have gone through this at various phases. If we were allied with somebody, we also tended to ascribe good moral qualities to him. So, for example, during World War II, Joseph Stalin, fresh from killing almost as many Russians as the Germans were, and the purges, suddenly became Uncle Joe. And Harry Hopkins could write from Yalta, "We have no doubt about the moderation and goodwill of Joseph Stalin, but we do not know what sinister forces are lurking in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to thwart his design." Can only hope that nobody intercepted that letter, because it would have started another big purge in the Soviet Union, since looking for people in the dark recesses of the Kremlin was Stalin's specialty. So we see it also in the post-communist period. First with respect to Gorbachev, and then with respect to Yeltsin. The United States has identified good relations with Russia, with a particular Russian personality, and believed that changing the domestic structure of Russia was more of a key to a peaceful foreign policy than dealing with its actual foreign policy performance. My point is that the period into which we are moving will not be very hospitable to such an approach. At the end of the Cold War, we don't have an ideological enemy, nor do we have any longer a geostrategic enemy that can be clearly identified as a permanent antagonist. We're living in a world now of 4, 5, 6 powers that, in terms of their capacity to influence events, are more or less equal. The United States, Japan, China, whatever emerges in Europe, whatever emerges on the territory of the former Soviet Union, Russia, the Commonwealth of Independent States, whatever it is, plus what else may develop in the next 10, 15 years in India and maybe even in South America. Those are the realities of our period. Certainly, in the nuclear field, we are uniquely powerful. But the issues to which nuclear weapons are relevant are diminishing almost non-existent. Bosnia, Somalia, Central Asia, North Korea, in none of them is the use of nuclear weapons appropriate. And so our relations with other nations will be determined by capacities that are still superior to those of any other nations, but are no longer so dominant as they were in the Cold War period with respect to the non-communist part of the world. And, as I already have pointed out, new power centers are emerging. Now, in such a world, there are only two ways to have stability. One is by hegemony, and the other is by equilibrium. Now, whenever I say equilibrium and balance of power, they say, here he goes again, went to a German school, learned it in Germany, burns candles on Metternich's and Bismarck's birthday. And it's a great predilection of his. Now, I have to tell you, in Germany, I was obliged to go to a segregated school where Bismarck was not the favorite subject, and the glories of German history were not self-evident to us. So whatever I learned about equilibrium, I learned from my study of history. If my former Harvard colleagues can stand it, most of it at Harvard University, where they don't really believe in it, but I came to heretical, where I came to heretical conclusions. America grew up with the luxury of choosing its involvements. Most other nations grew up in the school of hard knocks, where they had to look after their security with narrow margins of survival. And what the balance of power says is we have to try to arrange an international order in which the disagreements and conflicts will still exist, but they are kept to levels which do not threaten the overall system, in which nations may compete, but within certain limits. And you achieve this by making it very difficult for any nation or group of nations to achieve preponderant power. You don't rely on the goodwill, but on the self-restraint imposed by necessity. Now, I also believe that this works best not only when there is a balance of power, but when there is a certain community of values. And so the attempt to place equilibrium entirely on power can also have catastrophic consequences, as it did before World War I. But my basic point is that in the world into which we are moving, with these various power centers, some idea of the American national interest is absolutely imperative. And if we do not have this, we will find ourselves trapped time and again in situations in which it seems worthwhile to enter, but in which we either do not know how to extricate ourselves, or where extricating ourselves is very costly. Take Somalia. We became involved in Somalia because some television networks decided that they would take one case, very similar to 10 or 15 other cases around the world, of genuine starvation, and feature it. The American people, to their enormous credit, decided that this was an unbearable situation and insisted that something be done. And so long as what we were doing was humanitarian and financial, it was to the great credit of America, which took on the rehabilitation of the world at the end of World War II, which also no other nation has ever done before. But when we started sending troops into Somalia, is when we got into difficulties, because that left us with three choices. Either to stay there indefinitely and ignore the political conditions, for which there would be no public support, or to try to fix the political conditions which had produced the starvation in the first place, which, however, meant that in a country that for centuries had been torn by tribal war, we would end the clan warfare, and that guaranteed American involvement in a civil war. And third, that we would leave and permit the conditions that had brought us there in the first place to reestablish themselves. We tried the second course, as made sense. But after we had suffered 18 casualties, it was clear that we were not prepared to pay 18 casualties, much less any more. And so we were driven into the third option, which was to get out and leave the situation back to where it was. Now, I'm not blaming the people who got us involved. All I will say is I opposed it from the beginning. Nor do I blame the people who wanted to create a political solution there. I'm trying to draw the lesson from this, that if we do not know what our fundamental interests are, we will have more and more crises like this. Bosnia involves us in the same sort of considerations. And China does at the other end of the world. I would say, first of all, that people conducting classical foreign policy would be very careful about taking on a confrontation with Japan and China simultaneously. I would think it would be better to have one of them on your side. If you challenge them both, you're surely doing it the hard way. But it is true that the Chinese record on human rights is inadequate by American standards. And it is appropriate for the United States to advocate its fundamental values. The question is not whether we advocate them any more than it was whether we should give food in Somalia. The question is at what cost and to what length. And one has to remember that we have strategic interests in Asia, we have commercial interests in Asia, and we do not have the capacity to solve every problem that exists in the world simultaneously. How to strike that balance and in what manner to do it does not have a cookbook recipe. But that is the challenge of our period, especially when we face entirely new problems for which there's no precedent: population, environment, nuclear proliferation. And yet saying that these are general problems, which they are,